If you were to tune into the WWF or later WWE during the 90s and 2000s, it was a great time in general to be a wrestling fan. Maybe not all of it was your cup of tea, but there were undeniably amazing moments, from the generation-defining Attitude Era to the heart and soul of ruthless aggression. And many, if not most, of those moments were commentated on by a familiar voice. The voice of good old JR, Jim Ross. You'd be forgiven for thinking this was Jim's only gig, considering how iconic he was as a commentator for the WWE. It's understandable that a lot of fans only know him for that role. However, this wasn't Jim's first rodeo, so to speak. Jim Ross, in fact, broke into the business back in 1974. Among other things, before wrestling, Jim had worked officiating high school and college baseball, basketball, and football. That's American football for my fellow Limeys out there. This experience around athletics would lend itself well to Jim's introduction to wrestling. Whilst commentating for Northeastern State University's college radio, Jim was given the opportunity to fill a position on the broadcasting team of the local NWA Tri-State Territory, which would later become the Universal Wrestling Federation, but is best known for its time under the name Mid-South Wrestling, which is my favorite territory for those wondering, nothing cooler than Mid-South. This opportunity would lead to regular work as a referee for the young Jim Ross, and during this era, he was rubbing shoulders with wrestling's OGs. When Bill Watts took over the territory and named it Mid-South in '82, Jim Ross was subsequently promoted to Vice President of Marketing. Alongside his commentary and referee roles, Jim Ross was developing one hell of a CV. But this may have been where Jim Ross had reached his zenith were it not for a plucky young promoter known as Jim Crockett. Crockett bought Mid-South and merged it with his own group, Jim Crockett Promotions. The seeds were being sown for what would come to be known as WCW, and Jim Ross began doing color commentary alongside David Crockett and the least annoying Tony from AEW. When Ted Turner bought WCW, Ross was continuing to develop his once-in-a-generation talent for commentary, working his way up to an official role as the head of broadcasting for WCW. But this would all change thanks to a young, ambitious commentator who would shake the wrestling world to its core. Eric Bischoff had joined WCW. Bischoff and Ross were not the biggest fans of each other. Ross felt that Bischoff had rather disingenuously put himself over to Turner Broadcasting executives. Whatever Bischoff did worked though, as Eric was made executive producer in 1993. Eric's vision as executive producer was to emulate the WWE's success as a global entity, and Jim Ross did not fit that vision, which is kind of hilarious looking back. Bischoff didn't want Southern accents on the show's commentary team, as he felt that, in order for WCW to feel like a worldwide promotion, having a strong regionally defined accent as one of the most important voices on the show wasn't going to fly. Ross wouldn't have much time on air during this era, and seeing the writing on the wall, asked for his release from WCW, which he was granted. Ross was then hired in the role he would become an icon performing. He made his on-screen debut for the World Wrestling Federation at WrestleMania 9, taking over from Gorilla Monsoon on the discontinued Wrestling Challenge show. Ross would work alongside Bobby the Brain Heenan until Heenan left the Fed. Initially, however, McMahon may not have seen the vision for Jim being as iconic as he became. Ross was first brought in to call Mania and the King of the Ring with Heenan and Randy Savage. However, he was fired from the Fed on February 11, 1994, just 2 weeks after suffering his first attack of Bell's palsy, which, as far as conditions go, is perhaps one of the worst ones for a public-facing commentator on television to develop. Often, those with Bell's palsy have issues with slurred or muffled speech due to the muscle weakness and paralysis that occurs. It can lead to issues articulating and abnormal speech rhythms, an absolute nightmare for anyone to deal with, and it's a testament to the sort of man Jim Ross is that despite this, he was yet to become the icon in commentary we all know and love. Jim persevered, and it's damn inspiring. For goodness sake, give this man his flowers. During this time, Ross would commentate for Smoky Mountain Wrestling under Jim Cornette. Corny and Ross had known each other over the years, and the two Jims would develop a friendship that has existed in some form ever since. There's a lot of mutual respect between the two Jims, and with good reason. During this time, the Fed sort of played Jim Ross like a yo-yo. He was rehired, fired, rehired, and was allegedly leaking inside information to journalists. Can't have been too bad though, because they had him on syndicated programming for the next 2 years until in 1996, he rejoined the primary announce team and turned heel for the first time. Specifically, this had to do with the departure of Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Jim Ross would claim he was still in touch with Razor Ramon and Diesel and was going to be bringing them back to the Federation. If you're a wrestling fan, you already know where this is going. Fake Diesel time. Ross, during this time, cut a hell of a workshoot promo, claiming that whilst he'd been working in the front office of the Federation, he'd been the man responsible for people leaving the company as part of his revenge ploy for how the WWF had treated him in the past. This included outing Vince McMahon as the chairman and not just a commentator. People often misremember that Vince being revealed as chairman only happened on television thanks to Montreal. But here was Jim on September 23, 1996, absolutely wilding on Monday Night Raw. Naturally, this storyline wasn't well received by fans, and Jim Ross quickly stopped being a heel on television, which makes sense. None of us want to boo Jim Ross, it really is that simple. He continued to commentate on Superstars, Action Zone, Raw is War, and Shotgun Saturday Night, but at the end of 1998, Jim Ross would suffer another attack from Bell's palsy during the broadcast of Capital Carnage in London. Often, attacks of Bell's palsy are brought on by stress, and Jim had learned earlier that day that his mother had died. One of many tragedies that would unfortunately hit Jim over his life and career. Again, this speaks greatly about Jim Ross as a man, to have suffered such a deep and personal loss, and to continue working even to the point where his body failed him and exacerbated a health condition. Whether you think this was in any way morally right from the perspective of higher-ups in the Fed who could have given the day off to Jim, is a whole separate issue. Jim Ross sacrificed a lot over the years for the business, and come hell or high water, wouldn't let the fans down. When he recovered from his Bell's palsy, he would reprise his on-screen role for WWF. Now there's a lot I could tell you here, a million instances of hilarity, whether it's his beef with Michael Cole, or his hilarious calls, most of which you will be able to rhyme off right now, I bet. Crimson masks, government mules, slobber knockers, and men being broken in half even though they have a family, damn it. Somebody stop the damn match. Bloody beautiful use of the English language, as an Englishman I approve. Suffice to say, Jim during this era was an impressive orator, his voice becoming an integral part of the WWE world during this time and forever after. Even people who aren't fans of wrestling, if they imitate a wrestling commentator, they're imitating Jim Ross. That's how bloody iconic this man was to the craft, in a way that hasn't been replicated by his contemporaries, predecessors, or successors. And that's not to bag on any of your personal favorites. Maybe you love Pat or Corey or Michael Cole, but there will never be another Jim Ross, ever. He would continue to fight repeated bouts of Bell's palsy through his career, always pushing through to the best of his ability and alongside Jerry Lawler. I mean, there's no nostalgia quite like that. I see Jim Ross and Jerry Lawler behind a commentary table smiling, and I can't explain it, man, my heart just warms up. I'd have talked more about Lawler in this video, but given that this is a wrestling history channel, I have a lot of content planned for the King. Ross would unfortunately leave the WWE in 2014 under not-so-pleasant circumstances, which can be covered another time. He briefly returned from 2017 to 2019. However, he was barely used, claiming to have had only 2 bookings in 2018, which led to him declining to renew his contract. Ross would claim to have told Vince, quote, "Unlike you, I still think I can do play-by-play, and there are other people who believe I can do it, including some of your audience." Some is putting it mildly. Jim, we love you, mate. Jim Ross has since been working in AEW, and despite the odd verbal gaffe that is sort of expected from having to move from one company to another after nearly 30 years, over the years he's also contributed his commentary talent towards boxing, football, and alongside Chael Sonnen, has commentated for a one-night tournament pay-per-view in MMA. And I tell you something, there's no one I would rather have on my commentary team than Jim Ross and Chael Sonnen. Bloody hell. Imagine if Chael had been in the WWE back in the day as a champion, sitting in on commentary with JR and King. The hilarity would have been unimaginable. Jim Ross would also have a long marriage with a woman named Jan, who he had met on an airplane when Jan was a flight attendant. Unfortunately, after many happy years together, Jan was in a horrific vehicle accident in 2017, and unfortunately would pass away after 2 days on life support. As well as this, Jim would survive multiple battles with cancer. Just by what is publicly known about Jim Ross and what he had to go through, it's a hell of a lot. Which is why, as I draw this video to a conclusion, I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Jim Ross, on my own behalf and on behalf of my small YouTube community. Not only is Jim Ross a once-in-a-lifetime talent who will be often imitated but never replicated, not only is Jim Ross an integral part of my childhood that I will never forget about, but Jim Ross is also an example to us all of how to overcome adversity, how to get knocked down again and again, but keep coming back stronger for it. The respect with which his colleagues and contemporaries speak about him is an example to us all of how to conduct ourselves in our relationships with others, and how important that conduct will be to how we'll be spoken of. In general, he's a bloody great man and a hell of a guy to learn about and learn from. So from all of us sarcastic marks and from me personally, thank you JR. There will never be another Jim Ross.